So as human beings, we don't live in isolation, do we? We have relationships, whether it be work, personal or social relationships. And this is great, of course. It's one of the reasons why we're the dominant species on the planet, because of how we share information and work together. But this does bring with it a lot of inherent challenges. We don't always see eye to eye with everyone. Some people will do things that you don't agree with. Some will be downright disrespectful to you, maybe they'll even mistreat you or attempt to take advantage of you. So because of this, we have to have ways of letting people know what is acceptable and, more importantly, what is unacceptable behaviour to us. You know, when I was younger, I used to let people take advantage of me. I wasn't strong enough. I wouldn't tell them what I really felt for fear of being judged, disliked or not accepted. I don't know if you can relate to that. But then I reached a point where I was like, you know what? Enough is enough. I'm tired of this. And now I think I do a much better job of letting people know what my red lines are. One of the few benefits of getting older is you just don't take shit anymore. You say what you think. So what we're really talking about here, if we put more of a positive frame around it, is the creation of healthy boundaries. And in this episode of the podcast, that's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be going through what I call the 3 C's for creating healthy boundaries. Hey there and welcome to the Stress Less Living podcast. My name is Stephen Burns and I've been a practicing coach, trainer and hypnotherapist for 25 years. Each week I'll share easily digestible bite-sized ideas that you can immediately put into practice so that you can live a more harmonious and balanced life. Because life is challenging, but whatever we encounter, we always have a choice. We can take the easy route or the hard route, the low stress way or the high stress way. Well, the Stress Less Living podcast is about always looking for the easy routes in life, the low stress ways to accomplish your goals, get more of what you want, and ultimately live a happy and more effortless life. So if you're looking for the perfect antidote for the chaos of modern life, my friend, you are absolutely in the right place. So let's get started. So first of all, what actually is a boundary and why do you want to set them in the first place? Well, setting healthy boundaries is a way to define limits and guidelines for how you want other people to behave around you. And they become particularly relevant when people overstep the mark and behave in a way that to you is unacceptable. In other words, they cross the line, so you need to let them know that that's just not okay for you. So setting healthy boundaries prevent you from being taken advantage of, from being drained emotionally by others, and they can also help you avoid things like burnout, exhaustion, or spreading yourself too thin. So the first point I want to make before we go through this, like I said, I want to take you through the 3 C's for creating healthy boundaries, but the first point I want to make is that ideally you always want to set boundaries early on in a relationship. And this will be true for any type of relationship, whether it be personal, social, or workplace, it doesn't matter. Because the thing is, when people form relationships, we tend to go through a few different phases. First of all, we form together. Then there's a little bit of turbulence usually as all the different characters start to meld and merge together. There's a little bit of jostling about as you get to know each other. And then from those initial interactions, rules, standards and guidelines become established. And then over time, these rules, standards and guidelines become norms. They become accepted codes of behaviour within that group. So whenever possible, you want to be letting people know your boundaries during those initial interactions. That's what that phase essentially is all about. And if you're having trouble in a relationship, it's usually because you didn't do a great job of that during that initial phase. You weren't consistent enough about what your red lines were. Now, that doesn't mean it's your fault if the other person is behaving badly. It's not about assigning blame here, but you do have a responsibility to let people know what you deem to be acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. If you don't, then how are they going to know? And the second point I want to make is that you don't want to be just creating boundaries with other people. You also want to be creating boundaries within yourself and holding yourself accountable. It's important that you create your own internal boundaries and respect them as much as you can. So for example, say you're someone who values your health and well-being, but you frequently overwork to the point of exhaustion and then party like crazy during the weekend, and you feel like absolute, death every week, then you're violating one of your own inner boundaries for physical health. So you don't want to be seeing boundary setting as just an outside thing, it's also something you do on the inside for yourself. So that's the scene set. Let's crack on with the 3 C's for creating healthy boundaries. So the first C stands for contemplation. So you've always got to start off by looking within you. When our boundaries are being broken, it's very easy to feel resentment and blame other people. And that's usually a great sign that our boundaries are being challenged, of course. And look, I'm not absolving other people of their responsibilities, but to completely blame them robs you of your power to change things. And that's not good. So it all starts with inner contemplation. You want to see boundary creation as an inside-out process. So you're maybe wondering, what kind of things do you want to explore when you're doing this contemplation? Well, I'm going to suggest that there are 3 things that you want to consider. So the first is your red lines. This is a great place to start. So these are your non-negotiables. These are the things that if someone was to do them would be completely stepping over the line for you. And you can explore this in different areas of your life too. For example, for me in personal relationships, I massively value independence. So if someone starts to become controlling or bossy, that's a big red line for me. So if I sense that, I will push back against it. I'll give it a chance for it to be resolved. But if it continues, then there's a good chance that that relationship is over, or at the very least, I'm going to minimise it. Now, that might be a red line for you. It might not. At the end of the day, you're the one that has to decide. So you also want to consider your red lines at work as well. What are the things that are unacceptable to you? And this, of course, will vary from person to person. When I worked in the oil and gas industry, it was a pretty harsh environment. People would shout and argue with each other regularly, but it wasn't really a big deal for me. It was just the way that we talked to each other every now and again. There was nothing personal. It occasionally stepped over the mark, but not very often. But I know for others, or in different environments, this might not be acceptable, so it can vary. And again, you have to choose, and the way to do that is through contemplation. So the second thing you want to contemplate on is your needs and values, or in other words, your life priorities. So first of all, what are the base level things that you need to just be okay? So you might call this self-care. That's a very trendy way to describe it if you want to go down a whole hipster route. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is your basic needs, the things that need to be in place so that you know that you're okay. So, for example, it could be getting some time to yourself. That's a big thing for me. Personally, I feel smothered if I don't have that space. Maybe it's a certain amount of sleep that you need. Again, that's a big thing for me. I need my 8 hours just to function. Or if it's a workplace thing, how much downtime do you need before you can go at it again? Or if you like to exercise, how many times do you need to do that to feel healthy? For me, exercise is a joy. I love it. But it's also a need for me. If I don't exercise for a week, then I tend to get a little bit grumpy and I just don't feel right. Or maybe it's nutrition. Whatever it is for you, again, you want to be contemplating and figuring these things out. So you want to reflect on your needs, but you also want to reflect on your values. So this is going beyond your base level. What are the things that make you happy? What aspects of life do you love, cherish, enjoy? And of course, in relationships, whether it be work or personal life, there's always going to be compromise. You can't always get everything you want. That's not a relationship, that's a dictatorship. But you want to investigate what your values are, what things are important to you, and then from there, you can decide which of these aspects you'd be willing to compromise and which ones you want to keep. What are the no-go areas? So that's the second thing you want to have a think about, your needs and values, your life priorities. And the third thing you want to contemplate on, and I think this is a biggie, but many people don't go there, and that is you want to have a think about what your limits are. So as a business owner, because I set my own schedule, it's very easy to think that I can do way more than what I can actually do. Also, because I'm in the personal development industry, there is a big belief that as human beings, we are capable of so much more than we think. And I wholly subscribe to that. But for a while, this prevented me from examining my limits, because I was so focused on my unlimited potential. So I ended up just taking on far too much, thinking that I could do anything on a personal level. And it was a huge learning for me to understand my limits, physically, mentally, and emotionally. There is only so much that one person can do. So know your limits. This is a very useful thing to explore. So on this topic, another trap that people tend to fall into, and I've fallen into this trap many times, is to believe that the more effort they put into something, the more they'll achieve. And the thing is, this idea is not even true. That, at the end of the day, we all have to put effort in to achieve something to get things moving, but you'll always reach a point where all that extra effort starts to get in the way. The world starts to push back, and it can end up actually causing some damage. One example of that is going to the gym. If you go to the gym and work your biceps every day with heavy weights, you're not going to get results. In fact, you're going to injure yourself, because when you go to the gym, you actually damage the muscles, and you repair the muscles and get bigger when you rest. So if you just keep going, and keep going, you'll eventually just hit a wall, and it's going to damage you. It's going to be detrimental in the long run. So you need to know your limits. What can you do? But more importantly, what can't you do? So a good place to start with this is to ask yourself, what are the limits before you start to get tired? When do you begin to lose focus? What are your limits mentally, emotionally, and potentially even spiritually? When you work, how much rest do you need in order to be refreshed? In a relationship, what can you offer, but what can't you offer? And be clear about that from the beginning. What are you willing to offer? And when you know your limits like this, you have a better idea when to stop, and you can also better articulate these limits to other people. Also, when you know your limits, it's going to mean that you're going to have to say no to things more often. And I know that all you people pleasers right now are shouting, "No, I can't say no," when in actual fact, you did just say no twice, but anyway. But when you know your limits, you know when to say no. And I do know that for some people, this is very difficult because they maybe have that inner people pleaser in there. That's maybe a good topic for a future episode. But just remember, when you say yes to something, you are in fact saying no to something else. If you say yes to extra hours of work, that means that you're saying no to spending time with your kids, if you do have kids, or going to meet friends for dinner, or doing something else socially. Hey there, if you are enjoying this episode and you'd like to learn more about the fundamentals of meditation, then I have a video course that you can enrol on for free as a podcast listener. So this is normally a paid course, but as someone who listens to the podcast, you can enrol for free using the discount code in the show notes. So if you want to check out that, like I said, I'll include a link to that free meditation course in the show notes and all the information that you need. So that's the 3 things you want to have a think about, and that is the first C, which is of course contemplation. And the second C, if we move on, is communication. So now that you know what your boundaries are, you need to verbalise them. You need to let people know. And this is the reason why you start off with contemplation, because you now know what to communicate. A lot of relationship problems happen when we're not clear on our boundaries, but we attempt to communicate them anyway. So we end up just giving mixed signals, and it really just confuses people. I'm sure you've been in the receiving end of that too, where someone says something and how they act is very, very different. And it's super confusing and unpredictable. When this happens, it's usually an indication that the person hasn't clarified their boundaries within themselves, so it ends up being unclear to other people. So that's why you've got to do it in this order. But anyway, let's move on to communication. Once you know what your boundaries are, you then want to communicate them. You want to verbalise them. So the first thing I want to say on this part is that it's important to remember that people are not mind readers. I've seen some people get annoyed with others for not respecting their boundaries or behaving in ways towards them that they believe is unacceptable, but they've never actually let them know that. They've just assumed that because they know what their boundaries are, that it should be obvious to everyone else. And this might sound harsh, but if you do that, then that's on you. Some people are empathic, they have great social intelligence, and they can sense these things, but others aren't, so never assume that just because you know what your boundaries are, everyone else does so too, because that's often not the case. So how do you actually do that? How do you communicate your boundaries to people? Do you announce them all on Facebook? Do you make people sign contracts before you start any kind of relationship with them? Of course not. That would be super weird. I think unless someone really crosses a line, you want to be a lot more subtle about it. So the first tip I want to give you when it comes to communicating your boundaries is something I've already mentioned, but it's definitely worth re-emphasising, and that is you want to do it near the beginning of a relationship. That initial getting to know you phase where there's a wee bit of jostling, a wee bit of turbulence. Like I said, if you don't do it here, it can create difficulties further down the line. And while you can reorganise your boundaries later on, it's a bit harder because you're fighting against established norms. It's like you're pushing a snowball up a hill. So it's much better to do it early if you possibly can. So how do you actually do that? Well, the first way is to just be direct, just be honest with people. So one of the things that I like to do is to be firm, but without emotion. So to do it in a very matter-of-fact way. So I'll say something like, I'll explain the boundary and I'll say, this is important to me. It's pretty much a red line. It'll make things so much easier moving forward if you respect it. So I just wanted to let you know that. So some people, when their boundaries are breached, they fly off the handle and it's a major trigger for them. Or they get really emotional, really angry and upset and start shouting at people and start shaming them and all sorts of stuff. And they think that that will get the person to change their behaviour. And it probably will in the short term, but it usually creates a problem further down the line because people remember these things. They remember that emotional intensity. Also, they might think, wait a minute, this person has way too much baggage, they're way too high maintenance, and I know that sounds harsh, but that is the way that people think. I'm just being honest here. To give an example of this, so I remember a few years ago, I was on dates, and within the first half an hour, she announced to me that she couldn't stand men who chewed with their mouth open, and that was a huge red line for her. And I could just feel the emotional intensity behind it. And while I appreciated her letting me know what her red lines were, in the background I was thinking, this feels a bit weird, why is this so intense for you? And I've got to be honest, and again this might sound harsh, but it really did put me off because of how intense it was, and it just seemed like a strange thing to say right from the off. So I would suggest that you want to be firm, be direct. So do it without emotion, very matter of fact. That tends to have so much more power than being dead dramatic and involving lots of emotional intensity. So that's the direct way. If you want a more subtle method to communicate your boundaries, then you can actually embed them in the stories that you tell people. So to give you an example, say you started a new job and you're talking to your new workmates. You could tell them a story about someone at your previous work who used to get angry and shout at people, and you could then use that story to subtly let people know that getting angry and shouting is a red line for you. So you could say something like, in my last job, there was this guy who got angry all the time. He never knew how to talk to people, and eventually I had to say to him, look, if you've got something to say, just say it to me in a normal way without the theatrics. There's absolutely no need for it. And that subtly lets people know how you expect them to communicate to you. So that's the first tip. The second tip in terms of communication is to make it a two-way thing. So setting healthy boundaries isn't just about you telling other people what to expect. Relationships work both ways. It's also about you learning what their boundaries are so you can respect them. So when you're letting them know what your boundaries are, you also want to open the door for them to communicate their boundaries to you. So you can say, I'm sure you have your own things too, so feel free to let me know. You don't have to do that now, but the door is always open. At the end of the day, if you want people to respect your boundaries, you also have to be open to meeting the other person's too. Hey, it works both ways. So that's the second tip. The third tip, this is a super important one, and that is you always want to comment on behaviour, not character. So like I said, this one is really important. And it's relevant if someone attempts to breach your boundaries or crosses a red line, and you have to call them out. You have to let them know. So if you have to do this, you want to make sure that you comment on the behaviour that you see as unacceptable and not the person's character or personality. So to give an example, say you go out for drinks with someone and they start shouting at the waiter. And this is a total red line for you. You don't like people being like that around waiters. You just don't like people being like that at all. So you could say, look, I saw that you shouted at that waiter. I didn't like that you did that. Can you please be nice to them because that appears disrespectful to me? So that would be commenting on behaviour. Whereas if you were to say, you're such an angry person, that's horrible. Stop being nasty. That's just terrible. You're such a disrespectful person. Why is that? With this second statement, you're generalising it to the person. You're attacking their character, their personality. And firstly, this is just not a nice thing to do because you're not really in a position to be making judgments about people's character. But also, this will likely create a sizable rift because you've made it personal. At the end of the day, behaviour is seen as something that's changeable, but character is often not. So these kind of comments are going to be really taken personally and they won't like it, and quite rightly so. You shouldn't be going there. And the thing is, you just don't know what's going on with that person. Maybe they've had a terrible day and it's an unusual outburst. there's always a backstory. Maybe they're normally a nice person, and you've just accused them of being a nasty and angry character. So this is very important. Focus on the behaviour, not the character, not the person. On this topic, actually, there was an interesting study on relationships, and it focused on the moment that a relationship becomes fractured or potentially doomed. And it was almost always when they started attacking each other's character rather than just focusing on the behaviour. So this is really important if you want to retain that relationship in some fashion. So that's the third tip. And the fourth and final tip on communication is you want to make sure that you don't engage in avoidance behaviours. So you want to avoid avoidance behaviours, if that makes sense. Because when we get down to it, some people just don't like confrontation. Some people love it. I think the majority of people don't like it. And some people really have a thing about it. They have an intense fear of not being liked, so they just avoid any kind of conflict, any kind of confrontation. But the thing is, if you're like that, you end up just creating additional problems because you're not being honest and upfront. I'll give you an example. So when I worked in the oil and gas industry, I had a manager who was a lovely guy, great person, great to go out for a beer with, great conversationalist, really liked him as a person, but he hated confrontation. So he would avoid it, he would use distraction techniques and all manner of things to avoid actually just addressing the problem. And this ended up creating so many more other problems, and all of them could have been solved quite easily if we just spoke to people honestly and set the proper expectations. So if you notice that you're engaging in avoidance behaviours because you don't like confrontation, honestly, you've got to get past that, do your best with it, nip it in the bud before it grows arms and legs. You're creating a monster, you're adding extra problems that don't need to be there. So that is the second C, communication, and now we move on to the last C, and that is consistency. And this shouldn't need too much explanation. You just want to be consistent. People will get used to it and it then becomes a norm. To create healthy boundaries that last, you need to stick to it so it becomes a pattern. People know what to expect and they just slot into it. It becomes an accepted norm. Now, does that mean you have to be all fascist about it, like some kind of boundary dictator? Of course not. There will be your red lines, of course, absolutely, but you can still have some leeway. Just make sure that you're consistent with the key things, the things that matter most to you, and you can always have some give and take. At the end of the day, relationships, whether they be work or personal, are not just about you getting what you want, is a negotiation. There's always going to be some give and take. So other than your red lines, don't be too militant about it. There should always be some give and take. So there we have it, the 3 C's for creating healthy boundaries. Let's do a quick review. C number 1 is contemplation. You want to be creating your boundaries from the inside out. And you do this by contemplating, by reflecting, and figuring out what your boundaries actually are. And you can do this process across all of the major areas of your life. So you want to be thinking, what are my red lines? What are my non-negotiables? What are my needs and values, my life priorities? And what are my limits? That's the thing that people don't often consider, but it's very important to take a look at what you can do, but also what you can't do. And then the second C is communication. Once you know what your boundaries are, it's time to verbalise them. And I gave you lots of tips to help do that. Tip number 1 is you want to make sure that you do it at the beginning as much as you possibly can. You can always renegotiate boundaries later on, but it's going to be harder once those norms, those rules and standards have been set. And tip number 2 is make it a two-way thing. Involve the other person. Setting boundaries is not just about you, it's about you figuring out other people's boundaries as well. Tip number 3, comment on behaviour, not character or personality. Very important. When you're looking to call someone out for breaking or challenging your boundaries, talk about it in terms of a behavioural thing rather than making it about them as a person. Very, very important. And tip number 4, avoid avoidance behaviours. Nip it on the bud before it grows arms and legs. It's just going to add extra layers to it. And then the third C is consistency. And this is where you want to consistently communicate your boundaries. There's no point in doing it once. You want to stick to them, but don't be too militant. Don't be a boundary fascist. There's got to be some leeway because relationships are always a two-way thing. So thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I would appreciate it greatly if you could follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, it would be amazing if you could leave a review. It really does help get the word out about the podcast. So thank you once again for listening. and I'll speak to you next week.